probably don't have a receptionist, and you probably don't have somebody answering your phones. Your task list has changed because of technology. And in fact, for most professionals, our task list has gotten way longer because the cell phone and the technology lets us do it. And sometimes, partly it's just because our employers are cheap, but a lot of times it's because it's easier to do it yourself than explain to somebody what you want with the technology. So each occupation is a living list of chores and tasks. And that task list changes with technology. So when we're thinking about how this new technology will change the future of work, don't think so much that it's going to eliminate the entire occupation, which is the way that the public debate goes. Realize that it's going to change every single occupation and mean they'll need fewer people to do lots of jobs, but it won't eliminate many jobs. And the analogy I like to use is farmers and tractors. So there's this misperception in the press that the journalists and are primarily culpable of, is they look to see a new thing AI can do. And they write it up. Oh my goodness, robots can open doors. And then at the end of the article go, and in how many years will it be before they actually enslave the human race? And then they interview some expert and say, probably not the next 50 years. But they've planted in your mind that the fact that it can open a door now means it will become a human in just a few years. The only question is when. And I think we ought to think about AI as tractors. Tractors aren't like farmers in elementary school just waiting to graduate and become a farmer and replace the farmers and maybe enslave the farmers. I don't know. But that's not what AI is. AI is very good at very specific things. It will change a lot of professions, but it's not actually going to become human, at least in the foreseeable future, in my view, and my reading of the technology literature. The second, there won't be any mass unemployment, Rust Belt style. So automation and globalization in the past 2 decades showed up as traumatic factory closures or traumatic changes in trade patterns, goods. And frequently, you knew it was happening because it was in the headlines and it was traumatic. This is a book about a Wisconsin, a Midwest American city where a factory closed and there was all sorts of misery that came from it. And I would argue that many people are thinking the future of globalization will be like that. And when I say globalization's coming, they go, well, where are the factory closures? You don't see service sector buildings shutting down and everybody getting laid off. But what I want to argue with this is that that's not how this will come, because it's affecting the service sector, not the manufacturing sector. In fact, I'd like to say it's going to come like this. The iPhone infiltration. I want to make an analogy here between the way the iPhone came into our lives and the way GLOBOTICS will come into our workplace. So here's how iPhones worked. iPhones just 10 years ago was a mediocre phone with a short battery life. It did a couple other things. In particular, it was a brilliant music player. You could have your whole music collection in your pocket on your phone, so you didn't have to have 2 devices. But gradual innovation by innovation and changes in our own behavior, it started to becoming our newspaper, our email center, our social media manager, our bank, our payment means. It started changing how we find our way around cities. Young people can't read maps these days because they just look on Google Maps for where they're going. It changed how we find restaurants and coffee shops. You just point in coffee shop near me and it tells you the next one. That's changing the relationship of so many things. But my key point here is nobody knew that that was going to happen. Nobody even realized it was happening. It seemed like a series of twists and turns, not a trend, until 10 years later we go, how did we ever get along without them? And I personally remember how we did get along without them. It wasn't very pretty. We had to... Sorry? We keep imagining. You can imagine so many things. I think we ought to shut the GPS and the internet off for like half day every month just to keep people fresh, you know? So like people would learn how to write letters and read maps and, you know, talk to people instead of sending them messages. Maybe we ought to do that, I don't know. But in any case, the point is it was not recognized because it was so many uncoordinated decisions made by individuals. And each one of those decisions seemed trivial. But ultimately, it transformed our family lives. It definitely has transformed your work lives, as I can hear from the phones blinging as the reorganization of the Indian government goes on. Last night I started speaking at 6:45, and at about 7:15 there was like a wave of blings in the audience as people were finding out who their new boss was or wasn't. But so, you know, in many ways, Globotics will come into our workplaces in the same way. You'll use a foreign freelancer to do one task. Let's say it's copy editing in French, and you have somebody in your office who knows a bit of French and does the instructions in French. Now you get somebody freelancer to do that. Or instead of hiring an extra guy in the IT department, you have somebody online on the screen who can answer your questions for a half day a week. That won't seem traumatic. But eventually, half the IT department will be replaced by that. And eventually, it will come into our lives freelancing, but also automation. And in just a few years, I think we'll look back in the rich countries and say, how did we ever get along without software robots and without telemigrants? So, third point, job displacement is the business model, not job creation. So digitech is driving job displacement. Human ingenuity is driving job creation. So what I mean by that is it doesn't have to be that way, and it wasn't that way in the past. So if you think about the second industrial revolution, it was a job-creating technology. There was some automation, but there was so many products, electric products, electronic products, everything to do with internal combustion engines, all sorts of pharmaceutical products, all sorts of chemical products. Those jobs were created because of the technology, and we had to make factories and jobs for people to make those things that before we didn't know and didn't know we needed, but all of a sudden we needed. And human ingenuity this time is going to be driving the job creation because the AI geniuses are all designing algorithms to replace workers. That's the business model. You can, if the more you read from the AI guys, that's their plan, because they can get a big structured data set on what workers are doing today, and if they can replace 10% of the whatever it is, they can become a billionaire in the next 3 to 5 years without any regulatory changes, without major perception changes. Now, creating all these semi-professional jobs I was talking about, just think how complicated that would be. You'd have to change the laws. You'd have to change insurance policies. You'd have to get the doctors to be on board with it and the nurses. You'd have to get patients to accept that they weren't treating by a doctor. That would be a 10-year project, and it's not going to make anybody a billionaire. So what I want to argue here is that mismatched speed is the problem. Not the technology, not the direction of travel, not the eventual destination. It's the mismatch in speed between job displacement and job creation. Job displacement is being driven in the short run by the explosive pace of digital technology, and eventually it'll peter off and it'll slow down and human ingenuity will take over, just as we saw in the past with mechanization led eventually to all the jobs we needed. Computerization eventually led to all the jobs we needed, and now we just have to wait till it comes. But what this means is that pessimists in this debate think we're going to be stuck here forever. Because personally, they can't imagine what jobs are coming. And since they can't imagine them, they imagine they're not going to happen. But they just haven't watched enough science fiction yet. It's like, in any case, they haven't watched enough science fiction. All the jobs are coming. And the optimists in this literature assumes we're going to jump all the way over and we'll have all the jobs we need. I'm both a pessimist and an optimist because I think the problem is in the next 3 to 5, maybe 10 years, displacement will outstrip replacement. maybe not radically, but at least somewhat. And eventually, we'll get all the jobs. But that transition is what we have to handle. Okay, so let me go through the future of work here in the long run. What will the future jobs be? And I'd like to suggest that you rethink how you're thinking about the future of work. Because we can't know the names of those jobs. That's the nature of the thing. Or actually, if you knew the name, let me know. We can invest in it and we'll be billionaires in the stock market. We can't know yet. But we can think about what they'll be like. And I'd like to suggest that we ought to do this not by thinking about what technology can do, but what technology can't do. We need a process of elimination. Globots will do what they can. We will do what Globots can't. That's my principle. Globots is an even uglier name. That's globalization and robotics driven by digital technology. So the question when thinking about the future of work is, what can't Globots do? So let's look at AI. What can't AI do? Now there is a bunch of studies. This one is taken from McKinsey Global Institute in a report that came out in 2017 called A Future That Works. They're the optimists, right? And what they did was classify all the tasks that are done by Americans in the workforce into these 7 different activities or capacities. And the red bars show you what share of hours in the American workforce are done in these different things. And pretty much it's 1/7, 1/7, 1/7, except the last one, which is half that. Now, then they asked a whole bunch of AI geniuses, what can current AI do to automate these tasks? And they broke it down to a very granular level and then added it back up. And what you see is predictable physical activities, potentially 81% of the time could be automated with current AI. It's not already automated because there's a big lag between the leading companies and the rest of the economy, but potentially. And as long as you start in these top 3, physical activities, processing data, collecting data, about 2/3 of the tasks can be replaced. So roughly speaking, 2/3 of the jobs, although very few of the occupations, can be replaced. And you start coming down, you get all the way to managing and developing people, it's only 9%. Now, I would suggest to you that if you squint your eyes and say, what's true about the stuff at the bottom that's not true about the stuff at the top, is that the bottom part is the most human task. And there's a reason for that, because the most human things we do, you can't gather into a large structured database. Like when you're trying to motivate a team to do something, how would you even write that database? So if you can't write the database, you can't train a computer to do it with machine learning. Managing large groups of people, dealing with unknown situations, being curious, being innovative or creative, applying ethics. These are things that we can't gather large databases are not very well, or at least not now, and so they won't be automated for a while. Now, if you think that through logically, that means that this is what we will be doing, because the software, the white-collar robots, will be doing all the rest. We will do what software robots can't do, which is the most human things. And we can ask, what can't RI? I like to call telemigration RI, remote intelligence. What can't RI do? And there we don't have the same limitations because these are real humans with all the training you need in any possible field ever. The only thing they can't do is be in the same room. And some of the tasks in your jobs actually require you to be there, or at least it's vastly more efficient to have people together. Some tasks require face-to-face. Some people have to be in front of a machine. They actually have to be there. And the stuff that can't be done, especially in the rich countries, will be done by foreign freelancers for much less. So our jobs in the future will be more local. So putting that together, the long-run future of the work is more human, more local jobs, at least in the North. We'll be all richer, hopefully more generous. The trouble is we have to manage the transition. So I like to imagine Downton Abbey. I don't know if that's a popular series here in India. You know, these British aristocrats who go through the transition and they, have to learn to put their own clothes on and stuff like that. But this would be like Downtown Abbey, but all the servants are robots. Think how great that is. You wake up at 10 o'clock in the morning, you decide whether you have a glass of sherry, cup of tea, gin and tonic. Should I write a poem? Should I go horseback riding? How wonderful that world would be. I don't think we're going to see that soon, but we're going to a world where all the robotic things are taken out of human jobs. And what will be left is the human jobs. And if you can't think about the jobs that will be created using human skills, you're just not having enough imagination, or you haven't read enough science fiction. Star Trek, for example, those guys don't do anything, make anything. The machine, the computer, they go up to the computer and says, I want a milkshake. They get a milkshake. People don't make anything in that world. They only do services, but they find plenty of things to do, like fight aliens or, stuff like that. Okay, now how to prepare. I don't know how long we're going to go on. We have another couple hours, or no? It goes 9:10. Okay, it goes 9:10. Okay, we'll have lots of questions. Okay. So what I want to do is talk about prepare. And this is not a policy book that I wrote. It was a book where I wanted to go down to the village square in Europe and the United States and ring the bell and say, this thing is coming faster than you can imagine, in ways you can't expect, and you better get ready. Maybe it won't be explosive, but maybe it will. So I'm not arguing how governments should prepare. I'm arguing a little bit how humans should think about it in terms of training. So these are my 4 rules. First of all, the old rules won't work. So governments all around the world, at least in the rich countries, have developed a set of rules to deal with globalization and automation. And the primary rule is get more skills, more education, more training. For example, the European Union a while back decided they were going to be the knowledge economy, and they were training everybody to move into the knowledge economy. That's what we needed, more training. And what I would argue is when that worked, it worked because it moved you and your kids out of the way of competition with robots in China. It moved you into the service sector where there was no automation. There were no robo-lawyers. There were no robo-doctors. There was no freelancing where you replace, for instance, 20% of the lawyers with people sitting in London with South Africa. That was not possible. So what you wanted to do was make sure that you moved into that sheltered sector. And that's how you dealt with globalization. That's not how the factory workers dealt with it, but the primary message was get more training. And I think that's entirely too blunt right now, because the sheltered sector is becoming a lot smaller and looking different than it was before, because digital technology is letting computers think and therefore automate all sorts of jobs that couldn't be automated, including high-end jobs that require a lot of training. And digital technology is making remote workers less remote and so allowing foreign freelancers to take over jobs that used to be considered non-traded. So we have to be way more nuanced about these skills you need to avoid competition. So rule number 2 follows directly. Don't compete with AI. If you're thinking about spending years of training developing experience-based pattern recognition in something that can be gathered into a large structured data set, you're making a serious mistake, because white-collar robots will very soon be doing it faster, cheaper, and better than you can. The second one is don't compete with remote intelligence. And remember, I wrote this book for the North. So don't do a job where you personally can telecommunicate. So when I give this lecture, I launched the book in the United States in February, and at this point in the audience I say, how many people telecommute to work? And since it was the United States, at least half the audience would telecommute at least part-time. And then I would tell them, your jobs are the first ones to go. Because you've proven that a remote worker can do your job, or at least parts of your job. And once your companies have rearranged the workplace through collaborative software on the web, through team organization, through matrix structures, through agile organization, they will soon figure out that they can get some of those skills for 1/10 the price in the Philippines or Kenya or India. So in some sense, we're getting ready for it. So if you want to know how to avoid this, don't do a job which you can do remotely. Get a job where you have to be face-to-face with people or machines. And lastly, remember that humanity is an edge, not a handicap. And there's all sorts of education pushing everybody into STEM. Or even worse, teaching them how to code. Coding is one of the things that's going to be totally wiped out by machine learning relatively quickly. Not the architecture, though, not the geniuses. We'll still need them. But coding as a job will be disappearing soon. Remember, dealing with people, providing empathy, creativity, ethics, those are the things that will keep you out of competing with the Globots. So make sure you schedule those. I guess time's up. All right. So what governments can do, I'll skip that over, and I want to stop with the conclusions. Globotics transformation is coming faster than most think in ways that few expect. It'll create a better world if we manage the transition. The mismatched speed is the challenge. We can control the speed. It's our choice. And I'll just stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was indeed wonderful once more. We have a few minutes for questions. So may I request, and there'll be many questions, may I request you to please be brief. I'll collect maybe 3 questions in the first round and then 3 in the second. Yes.
My name is Dr. Sanjeev Patjosi.
Just talk loud, I can hear. I'll repeat your question.
One thing we predict that is a cyclic way, and we'll go to again the cave culture by the evolution of technology.
So we go, what's the cycle?
Initial cave living type, again with the same primitive, because it will come to a certain level, then we go back to the same old evolution from the cave itself.
Okay.
Do you predict that?
Prashant.
Let's talk about it. Let's gather a bunch of questions. That's
Yeah.
a hard question.
Yeah.
My name is Prashanta Roy. Just a quick question on the speed mismatch graph that you gave, which is very interesting and which is fairly optimistic because it shows that the job displacement and the job creation, there's a net zero stage and then it's net positive. But those jobs are different, right? And that's a huge issue because you still have jobs which are getting displaced and they can't be retrained into those, and you're going to have enormous demand for jobs which may not be filled by available people. So although it looks optimistic, you'll still have a huge gap there which is not showing up in that graph.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. How do we...
We'll come back.
Keep order.
Okay. Well, you talked about the speed of change. Now, let's say with and about the amount of data sets you need for these large databases which cannot be programmed really. Now, let's say with generative adversarial neural networks or recycle GANs, the number of data sets you need to provide really are very, very small. You can actually come out with solutions with very limited data. And again, what you're talking about, the deep learning, and if you're an expert, for instance, let's take an analogy of the convolutional neural networks. And you look at the recursive convolutional networks, it depends on the number of layers in the network. Now, if you're an expert and you add a layer, that's probably a job that's never going to be obsolete. Once a layer has done its job, that job is going to be automated and obsolete. But if you're the person who's creating a new layer of excellence, of expertise, then that's maybe the place where a knowledge worker ought to be in the future.
Okay. So why don't you take these 3, then I'll take second round. We'll get a second round.
Right.
We'll get a second round.
So
don't worry.
the cyclic wave.
Yeah. Also. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. The cyclic wave, everything goes around, comes around, and I do, believe in cycles. But what I'm worried about is the next 3 to 5 years, and I don't see a wave. I see a wave, not the circle of the wave. As you probably know, waves are actually driven by circular movements of water in the ocean moving forward. But I think for the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see forward progress of the globotics transformation. and may eventually really change the way we work. And it's, you know, I read lots of science fiction, but I think I'm not willing to or interested in talking right now about far enough out where this thing starts coming around. So I don't deny it, but it's beyond my pay grade, let's put it that way. The speed mismatch. So I think a couple of points there are very interesting, useful, maybe useful, is for one, since this is in a service sector, you're talking about workers who are intrinsically more flexible than manufacturers or farmers. So somebody who's doing a service job at the age of 50 and loses their job, there are lots of other things they can do. So the unemployment will show up, not in terms of people sitting on their hands and on the queue, on the dole. It'll show up in people who get downgraded. They'll get jobs that are more precarious, less career-oriented. So they are also in cities where there are lots of jobs, most of these people. So I think the way this will show up is not a factory closure where everybody's unemployed for months and desperate. It's that you will go from a steady job with career prospects and a pension plan to being a freelancer with 3 or 4 different jobs, short-term contracts. It's precarious, and you're probably taking a pay cut. So I think the fact that it is in the service sector will make the adjustment easier in some ways and very difficult to pick up. And one of the things I was arguing at the Commerce Department yesterday is that perhaps we ought to invent a new category of unemployment, which isn't based on the number of hours you work, but by how precarious the position is. And I think even if everybody goes from good contracts, you know, maybe not lifetime employment, but good steady contracts, to a gig economy, people will be way worse off. And in some sense, they're unemployed in terms of the expectations they had a few years ago. Now, the neural networks, I try very hard to get in discussions when people start talking about adding layers, because I'm a humble economist. And I'm willing to take your approach to it, that adding layers will eliminate another thing. And the guys who do that will become billionaires. But they're doing it by replacing lots of jobs. So I don't know if I actually answered the question, but I kind of sidestepped it because I'm not a technologist, and I'm glad you actually didn't object hugely to my characterization of machine learning. So if we can quickly move on to the next question.
So we'll take another round. Yes, lady here, then I'll come to you.
Thank you, Professor. That was indeed a treat. It was absolutely marvelous. So thank you very much. And you've got me very, very anxious, primarily because the way you spoke about it in your answer right now too, you said that jobs are going to get a lot more precarious. And there's this whole concept of the telemigrants and people who are then able to do gig work long distance. And my concern then is that do you also envisage that not just an inequality otherwise, but gender inequality also likely to increase because of this? With increasing informalization in economies where these gig economies will be placed, whether women are able to come, I know you found a lady there, but whether women are able to come onto that in sufficient numbers, is there going to be likely to be greater marginalization of women in the scientific gross stroke non-scientific future that you foresee?
Right, thank you.
Yes.
I have a question.
No, 1 minute.
No, I mean, what I couldn't understand clearly is when you said humanity is an edge and not a handicap, how will all this help us in more sustainable living? Because much of the technology is benefiting only a very small minority of the population. For the vast majority who are all striving and struggling for sustainable living, civilization is going downhill. So you do refer to the moral imperatives, but then technology, there's a big chasm.
Right.
So how do you bridge that, and how is it going to provide for a greater sustainable living for the vast majority
Okay.
who are hungering for better life?
Hello, I have a question.
Thank you.
Yes.
I enjoyed very much. It's very enlightening and
Thank you.
inspiring.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah. You referred about GLOBOTIcs, Digitech, and what I could get is that the jobs which are process-centric, which actually work in a predictive environment, they would actually go to, they would go to that space of Globotics or Digitech. Just a thought, there might be jobs, there would be jobs which will actually work in unpredicted environment. Apart from jobs which are strategic, which requires strategic decision making, that will be with the human, that cannot be passed on to Digitech space.
Yeah.
So apart from top level management, strategic decision making space, there would be jobs which might be at the grassroots level, but they work in unpredicted environment. Do you buy my point?
Yes.
That would be a space wherein jobs would be there?
Very good.
So,
Let me go through these. First of the
one more after.
yeah, very very quickly on gender inequality. So I actually talk about this in the book, and the way I'd like you to think about it is that in the three great transformations. So the first great transformation was all about mechanization and taking the horse out of horsepower and put it into manpower. So it was fundamentally good for people who work with their hands and only tangentially good for people who work with their heads. The second one, the technology, provided substitutes for people who work with their hands, better tools who work for their heads. This technology, I believe, is providing more brain for people with heart. It's not giving more heart to people who have brains. So fundamentally, think about medicine. Think about what an extremely good AI that does diagnosis would do to medicine. It would make all the nurses and physician assistants and even healthcare providers way more productive. And you would go to them not because they knew how to use the AI better than somebody else, but because their bedside manner. They made you feel good. You trusted them. So I think systematically this brain power is being given to average people, and maybe human features will be more important. But I'm an optimist, and you can see where I was going with the gender with that sort of thing. The other thing is, since people will be able to work remotely, it's less disruptive to people's schedules. So maybe whoever's the child care provider can work in more flexible environments, and that may also be gender positive. Humanity and sustainable living. Again, I'm an optimist. I think this is going to make our jobs more human. I think it's taking the robot out of the jobs and will allow us to worry about the human things. I think ultimately we'll be spending more time with humans in the jobs that are left, at least in the North. And I think that will be good. As I said, we'll be richer. We'll have more things. Hopefully that'll make us more generous. So I think the humanity will come out. But I will admit that it depends upon what type of science fiction you read. Now, there's one science fiction, which is a Terminator, where the machines take us over. That's not a very sustainable living kind of world. Then there's Star Trek, where need has been eliminated by whatever. The computer does everything you need. By the way, did you know Star Trek was not science fiction? It was a documentary. They were talking to computers in the 60s. They had cell phones in the 60s. They had tricorders and laptops and iPads. It was actually a documentary. So I take that line. And then there's something in between, like Harari says, where we will have to embed technology in ourselves in order to compete with them, which doesn't sound very sustainable or human either. So to me, that's again beyond my scope, beyond the 10 years. But I don't think it's inevitable that letting computers do a certain type of human cognition undermines our humanity. It may make it easier for us to be kinder, have more leisure time, be more respectful and whatever. So I don't know. And process-centric, exactly. So that was what I was trying to say at the end, is the jobs which you can codify that are process-centered, those are going to be toast in just a few years. And anything that requires unpredictability, where you can't get the data set, that's where the jobs are going to be. So I agree totally.
Okay, we'll take one.
Yeah, hi. Hello. Yeah. Thanks for a wonderful talk, Professor Baldwin. I'm here. Yeah, no, here. First thing I wanted to ask is, in your example of large data sets, how exactly do the computers recognize the cats? And secondly, you know, AI is from what you've described it, it seems going to be a very destructive force that's radically going to change the world. But why are we designing it as such? Why can't we design it better where it benefits humanity? And as far as I can see, the AI revolution's being designed in the United States and not in Japan, not in China, not in India, and not in Brazil or other countries of the world. So being a US-centric revolution like the entire computer revolution has been, why can't you all design it better? And it's going to consume other resources. It's going to consume steel, rare earths, electricity, the circuits that feed a computer. So how are we going to sustain that side of it?
Okay, good evening, Mr. Richard. I just have a small question. See, we India are always believe in democracy. So nowadays, you know, using this robotics and things like that, a simple thing which this particular elections which we have faced is the EVM machine, where few of them still have the doubts in why the machines work properly or don't work properly. Thinking as a democratic country, so when this, people say it doesn't work in a wrong, but still there are people who believe that yes, it is working. So how do we convince the people, because we work for the democracy ultimately, because earlier we had a paper slip where we write and vote, but nowadays we do have a ballot where people tell that it changes. So how is this going to lead to the future world? Thank you.
Hello, sir. Good evening, sir. Sir, sir, the World Economic Forum data, I just came across that. It suggests that there will be a loss of 5 million jobs. There will be a 5 million job loss due to this AI and automation and robotics. And at the same time, 2.5 million will be generated. So does it indicate, it indicates for reskilling. My question is that does the government of the day or government or policymakers need to have a very short-run skill gap projections rather than for say 5-yearly or 6-yearly, just to have an informed labor market?
Professor, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I enjoyed a lot. My question is on the graph where you show how human think a transfer or a transition would happen a linear way, and how actually it happens, that S curve. So the question is it possible, is this curve same for different jobs, like how fast my my car will be driven by automatically, versus how fast the aeroplane will be driven automatically? Second question is, which is more important, I'm looking forward to that. Is it possible to reduce the difference between these two? So can the linear curve, or can human come or start thinking closer to how the digital innovation is happening, how to reduce the difference between these two? Because this is a theory, and if it is possible to reduce the difference, probably going forward there is a better management of the change. Thank you.
Hello, sir. Fruits of the globalization is eaten by most of the developed country. Now, you people are taking globalization, robotics, AI. You will see how much America developed after globalization. When you people utilizing globalization, robotics, or AI, then what will happen to country like this, where more than 50% are poor or illiterate?
Good evening, Richard. With reference to K-12 education sector, now if you see, learning in schools have become more online, flipped classrooms, and robotics has kind of replaced classroom teaching. And as we say, teachers are now becoming more of facilitators than teachers. So my question to you is, for the entire teaching or the K-12 sector, how do you see globalization, robotics, or the future of the world coming along?
Okay, let me take those very quickly. How does a computer recognize a cat? And the answer is nobody knows. So the one time they tried, a number of AI scientists are trying to do unstructured learning. And one of the most famous examples of that was they showed this deep learning algorithm a lot of clips from YouTube and didn't tell it what it was looking for and hadn't labeled the things. It just said, find some stuff. And if you've ever watched YouTube, you realize it found cats. There's an incredible number of cat videos on the YouTube. So it did actually independently recognize a cat. But it also recognized something that turned out to be a combination between a couch and a goat. And nobody actually knows what it thought it was or where it came from, but the nature of this thing is it's unknowable. Exactly because in your own mind, you don't know how you recognize a cat. You might if you have a perfect line sketch of a cat, you'd know which lines you'd want to put in. But if you see a random picture, you wouldn't know how you do it, and the AI scientists don't. Why isn't it designed for goods? So first of all, I would point out it's not just in the United States. If you go to Silicon Valley, you see Indians, Chinese, Koreans, and even a few Americans. And AI in China is being developed as fast as it is in the United States. And in India, down in Bangalore, companies like Infosys are developing AI at an incredible pace because they're leapfrogging themselves. They're replacing Indian workers doing outsourcing with these robotic process automation in-house. So first of all, I would deny that it's just the US. But I would agree with you that nobody is directing this for the good. There's a few people who are using AI like for recognition of outbreaks of plagues or how to deal with disasters to help people find the other families and that sort of stuff. But the vast majority of it is profit-driven, and it's driven for replacing jobs. Nobody's thinking about the good. And I think that is a serious problem. There's a lack of governance of AI. For instance, there's not even an international convention to say that we shouldn't use AI to develop autonomous weapon systems. That doesn't exist. The Geneva Convention, a lot of people try to ban landmines, but they haven't got a ban for autonomous weapons. Most countries have a Department of Agriculture, which they should, but they don't have a Department of Digital Technology or AI. Very few people, very few professions have ethical guidelines. In medicine, there's a number of them, mostly are private. So I agree totally with you that the government has to wake up and start regulating this, and the idea that everything that industry does is a good idea is probably wrong. And I think people, especially in the United States, are starting to turn on some of the big tech companies because they don't want them defining what's hate speech. Why should Facebook define that? Why should Google own YouTube? So that they also know all the videos we watch in addition to all the searches we do. So I think there's a bit of a pushback coming against that. So let me go on. Democracy and technology, a serious issue. I don't know how to deal with it, but probably be a technological issue. But it goes even further than that. It's security issues in general. As everything comes online, everything becomes vulnerable to hacking and things like that. And probably we should be spending a lot more of this AI intelligence figuring out how to secure things rather than just process things. But again, that would be a public good. And there's plenty of people working on security in certain sectors, but probably securing elections is something we should worry more about. Job creation and displacement, how fast, how to bring the gap together. So there's a whole industry of people in the consulting world who are helping you anticipate digital disruption. Like McKinsey does it, A.T. Kearney does it, Accenture does it. They have people trying to help each company narrow that gap and look for, detect symptoms of digital disruption that's coming. So there are people who do think about it, and it's not impossible. But forewarned is forearmed. The different holy cow moments in different industries, most definitely. In fact, we've seen a whole series of holy cow moments. The mainframe computer industry had their holy cow moment in the 70s when PCs came. PCs had their holy cow moment when the cloud came. And there's been a whole series of holy cow moments. So it's just an illustration of a misthinking of how technology moves. Reduce job disparity between disruption and creation. So I think that's important to think about how to create jobs as well, but I'm just a little afraid that it's too late for that to really be effective, and we're looking at a disruption in the next 3 to 5 years, which no government program will be able to compensate quickly, at least in the rich countries. The emerging markets. So I wrote this book for the rich countries on purpose because I think that's where the upheaval is going to come, and that's where it's going to be most disruptive. I'm writing a paper this September for Wider, where I'm looking at what the Globotics transformation means for development. And I think the general speaking is this will be an export opportunity for developing countries. At least middle-class people in middle-income countries who have skills who are radically underpriced by world standards will now be able to export their services more than they would before. So personally, I think the emerging market miracle will spread, diversify geographically, and I think those new miracles will look a lot more like India and a lot less like China. They won't be based on the export of manufacturing goods, including the global value chain. They'll be based on people in Kenya providing services and offices in London and Rome and Paris and Uruguay and in New York, et cetera, like that. So, but I'm an optimist. Learning, teaching, and facilitator. So Digitech has been in the education system for a very long time. I actually have a massively online course for my 2016 book called Globalisation, which is for free and future learn, and about 12,000 people have found it. But my course at the Graduate Institute is still oversubscribed, even though they could all watch it online for free. The reason is, I think, and you look at this McKinsey stuff and many of the other people, education is a very human thing. And what teachers are doing in the class and why class size matters so much is because it's so human. Now, I think many aspects of teaching will be automated, like grading, or at least I'm hoping it will be. In Japan, teachers use helpers. There's a little robot called Pepper, which can do a variety of things. Like when you're teaching English, Pepper can go to each child and get them to repeat peanut butter 12 times at the same time. So they're amplifying the teacher, but you still need the teacher in the room. So I think in many, and also telemigrants will be very important. Language training in Japan is done largely in the Philippines, for example. So I think it will change lots of things, but I don't think it'll eliminate the teaching. And I think hopefully what it'll do is allow increased customization per child. Because I saw at Davos last year, there was a woman doing emphatic AI. And it was a computer using unstructured learning interaction with an individual child, and it was trying to teach autistic children algebra. So it would develop a relationship. This AI was training itself to develop a relationship in the reactions of the child itself, and once it got the trust and was understanding what this autistic child was thinking, you know, without understanding it, it started teaching it algebra and the child, and back and forth. So I think in principle, the customization that's possible with machine learning could make teaching more effective and more personal. But I don't see, and none of the experts think, that education is the one out. It's management and education are the lowest down. And I wish I taught management, but at least I teach.
I think we must close. But before we close, if this talk is not going to make you all read the book, nothing will. So before you go, we're going to release the book. Yeah. Here we go. Thank you, Richard. There we go. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let's just do one book.
Yeah.
We can like this here together.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you take one picture with my phone? It's an iPhone 10.
244 million times faster than the Apollo 11.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. This was... That's great.
Thank you.
Great.
Appreciate it very much.
So I'm not going to summarize, but what I would say is that those of you who want to continue the conversation with Richard, there's going to be cocktails and dinner outside. So you're welcome to join us and engage further with Richard. And do buy the book. It's available on Amazon and, of course, in bookstores around Delhi. And Amazon doesn't have a heart, so go to the bookstores around Delhi, interact with the bookseller, and buy it from there. And you can bring it back to Richard to get it autographed. Thank you all for coming. It's been a great evening. Thank you.
That's what I just I think about last okay. Because my things are going on in that side.